Hilchos Taruvos, Siman Kuf, If Aleph. Starting a new topic for today's shir is on Berya. Berya afilu be'elef lo batal. Says the Mechaber Sif Aleph, Berya, Dahainu kegoin nemola. Berya as an example of a Berya as an ant. Oy tame, a non-kosher bird. Begid hanoshe, ve'ever min achai. Ubeitza sheish ba froyach ukiyotze behem. So the Mechaber enumerates a few examples of some things that are considered a Berya. We'll define that term in a moment. If you have any of these items, an ant, a non-kosher bird, gidanosh, and so on, afilu be'elef lo batal, if that object falls into your taruvis, falls into your Erev Shabbos cholent, an ant falls into your Erev Shabbos cholent, so now the whole thing is aser. Afilu be'elef lo batal. Ve'ein lo din Berya. So a Berya is something that requires chiyus, something that was living. So if you had a chita of iser, of whatever that iser is, orla, whatever, not orla, the chita is not orla, but if you have a chita that is aser, like the shach brings down kilaya, for example, so that doesn't have chiyus. That's not a living object. I mean, in botany we call them living, but it's a different type of living, as we know. The other requirement to be considered Berya is something that was aser mitchilas biryasa, that was always like that. Lafuke, oif tahor shenisnabel. So if you have a regular chicken that just happened to be nisnabel, so that chicken was mutter, it just happened to become aser at the time of the shechita. So that would be an example of something that is not a Berya, despite the fact that it looks like a Berya, that it's no different than a non-kosher bird, but it's very different because a non-kosher bird was always non-kosher. A kosher bird that was nisnabel became non-kosher when it was shechted, even though technically you can. What are you going to ask? It was never mutter. It was never right. So you can say it had eno shchuta. So that's a very interesting concept. But still, the has to be something that is that was shayach in an iser. Being that this thing is shayach in a heter, it's not considered a Berya. You're right. Ein chanami. It's a very interesting. Yeah, there's a very lengthy, even in the Rishonim places, in Shavuos, Chavdalid, and other places, in Yevamis, there's something called the mechazik mi'isr le'isr, and the idea is that the even when we talk about a non-kosher bird, there's a new isr that hits the scene when you shecht it, right, or when it's nevela, and that's called a nevela. That's not the same Isser necessarily as the Isser beforehand. The Isser beforehand, you're right, was an Isser of Ever Minachai, other Isurim. So it could be that's what the Mechaber means here, is that the Isser that we are now donning up is the Isser of Nevela, perhaps. Even though there is a discussion that you can view the Isser of Eino Shchuta or of Nevela as a continuation of the original Isser of Ever Minachai. In any event, that's the way the Mechaber puts it. Just on that point, the Shach writes, V'kolshkein nitraf. So the Shach brings down that this would be true certainly by the case of treifa, the same thing, like an example of a oif tahor shenisnabel. Another example of something that is not a Berya is a shor haniskal. V'chein tzarich she'eh davar sholem. Another requirement, it needs to be sholem. She mechalek ein shmoi alav. It has to be something that it's only as a shame when it's a davar shalem, but if you start chopping it up, ain't shmoylav, lafuke chelev, v'chein tzarich shehei shalem. So coming lafuke chelev, so example chelev, although it had chiyus originally, but since when you cut it up, it's still a chelev, so that doesn't have the status of a Berya. V'chein tzarich shehei shalem. The other requirement is that it actually needs to still be a shalem, as opposed to if you chopped it up, it's not considered a Berya. The Rama says, "V'ikar gira nasha eno ela al kaf bavad v'hu karoich dalet etzbayas v'im hu shalem mikre Berya." The Rama tells us what exactly are the parameters of a gira nasha. Okay, so this is the halacha Berya. As we know, Berya primarily hits the scene when it comes to tolayim. Tolayim is probably the most common example of Berya that we have to deal with in today's days. Whether it's in your strawberries or any vegetables for that matter, that you have a chash of bugs, it's not just so simple to say, okay, it's batal, because you always have the problem of Berya. And as we spoke out yesterday, it's not so simple necessarily to start crushing them, because that might get into the Isser of Eimavat and Isser L'Chatchila. But we also discussed in passing yesterday that the poskim write in Siman Pei Daled that there are kulas that around these things when you don't know that there are bugs and you're only chopping it up, al shash that maybe there are bugs, so then there are lots of kulas because you're not really trying to mevatel the isser. Your point is not because it would be so geshmak to have strawberries with isser, as opposed to what you were telling us yesterday that now people are putting, in Europe you said they put bugs in their bread in order to create protein. That would for sure be a problem of mevatel isser. It would, I don't even want to get into that because I'm not qualified to paskin on such a thing, talk about it, but it sounds like things like that should vada be usher. Okay, let's speak about a few points over here with regards to Berya. The first is the svara. What's the svara that Chachamim did this? Well, and first we should point out that the whole thing is only the Rabbanan. It's a Rabbanan, it's not a Deraisa. If it's a Deraisa, it's a Deraisa. But it's a Rabbanan. Being that it's a Rabbanan, we would like to understand why Chazal did this interesting Chumrah. So the Taz jumps in on this point and he says as follows. He says the reason is because since a Berya, there is a Svara D'Oraisa to it. And the Svara D'Oraisa, the Marmakis tells us that you can get Malchus on eating a Berya. Even though, generally speaking, Isur require Kazayas, B'chola Tarakula, the Shir Achila is a Kazayas. But if you eat a Berya, if a guy eats a little ant, so he gets a Kazayas just on that. Okay, that's the Marmakis. But Maha Kesher to Bittul, what's the Kesher? So the Taz writes, he says, because of the chashivas. He says, chashivas the Berya, shalote betela, him midrabanan, the kavan shemin ha-Torah, yesh chashivus, the loikin ala chilasa, afilu pachos mikazayis, the stomach siv, it's all minim tmeim, lo soichel oisav, afilu him katanim, al kein echniru rabbanon, betaru v'shalem. So the Taz says, makes some kind of connection, that the fact that the Torah gives these things chashivas, so by saying you get malchus by eating pachos mikazayis, so therefore Chachamim came along and they created a chumrah that they're not batal. That's what the Taz writes. Now it still needs a little bit of hesber because generally speaking, when Chachamim make their gezeras, so they make their gezeras as a way to protect the deraisa. So what deraisa are they protecting here? It sounds like in the Taz, he doesn't really spell it out, but it sounds like in the Taz, he's just saying is, since this thing has chashivas min ha-Torah, that you get malchus, so therefore it's ain't a batal because of its chashivas. True, but min ha-Torah, it is batal. The Torah says that despite the fact that it has chashivas, it is batal. So why are Chachamim making this extra chumrah? So there are a bunch of explanations out there in the books. One explanation is as follows, that it could be that at kama that the Torah gives it chashivas, so it could be that really, be'enei habrios, this is the type of thing that should not be batal. Meaning, the way I would look at it as a simpleton, a simpleton. I'm just a guy on the street, and you tell me that the bug is batal. I would think, my simple mind tells me that the bug should not be batal because it has chashivas. And when I see that it is batal, I'm going to start getting confused, and it's going to bring me to mezalzel in hilchos bittul. And therefore, Chachamim say, in order to protect us, let's strengthen the Torah by saying that it's not batal. Perhaps that would be one explanation. Another explanation, entirely brought down by some of the Rishonim, it's not different than the Taz, that it could be that it's a way to remember, that we want you to remember the fact that the bug is there. Because okay, fine. That's that. Okay, so that's a svara. Some other points over here to bring down is the very, very important. The whole chumrah of Berya is only by yavish, not balach. Meaning, so if you have, and we'll see this in a moment, if you take, let's say, an of tameh, an of tameh is a good example because it does give up a lot of time as opposed to a bug, which is nosin tam lifgam, so we're not as concerned with the bug. But when it comes to an of tameh, it gives real time. So if your of tameh falls into your pot of cholent, so we say yafilu be'elif labato. Now, what does that mean? What that means is that the bird itself is ein bato. Bird is generally recognizable, so anyways, it's not bato. So what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to remove it. Anyway, you're going to have to remove it, even if it was not bato. And when you did remove it, what's going to happen now? What's going to happen is that you have tam in there. The tam is bato. The tam of a berya is batal in regular shishin. When we say that a berya is in a batal, we are referring to mitzad the din of yavish b'yavish. So the example would be, if I have a whole thing of birds over here, I have 60 kosher birds, and then this one non-kosher bird falls in. Again, it sounds like a case that's almost impossible in my mind, because if how could you not recognize that which bird is which? But it doesn't make a difference. Let's just use the example anyway. I have 60 kosher birds. I have one non-kosher bird falls in. So that's actually, you don't even need 60. It would be batel berobi deraisa. You would have thought. But the halach is ain't no batel afilu be'elef. So we're discussing here a case of yavish b'yavish. The more shchia case would be the case of eggs. So if I have an egg and one of the eggs is considered a berya, we'll discuss eggs in a moment, and that egg falls into a basket of other eggs, so then the eggs are not batel because they feel be'elef. But again, the tam is batel. So if you can recognize the egg or the of tameh, you can remove it and everything will be fine. Okay, that's the loch of that. A little bit on eggs. So eggs is a very interesting discussion. The example the Mechaber gives is beitza sheyesh bo efroach. And that's the case of a berya. It has an efroach in it. So an efroach we know is aser because the Gemara Beitza darshans that an efroach. Now, what do you mean? Why is an efroach aser? An efroach is a bird, and a bird is a kosher thing. Why is a beitza sheish bo efroach? So we learned earlier that an efroach, the Gemara Beitza darshans, an efroach has a din of a sheret. That's machlok is a poskim, whether it's a derabanan or a deraisa. That whether the efroach itself is a derabanan deraisa, it doesn't make a difference for our topic. But the efroach is aser. The Gemara Beitza says, okay, because since it's so young, therefore it looks like a sheretz. Fine. Now, why does it make the beitza a berya? The beitza is not really aser. Really, the efroach is aser. Like what's happening here? So in a chanami, the crazy place he writes that really the ikar halacha here mitzad berya is not so much mitzad the egg. He says what's the berya is the efroach itself is considered the berya. Now the Shach struggles with another point here. He says that wait a minute, the efroach is not considered aser mitchilasai. Why? Because he says that the way the egg forms, how does an egg form? The egg starts off with a substance, and then it turns into a bird. So he says that's not considered aser lebriasai. Very interesting shach, because the truth is, if that were the case, you would make that argument literally about every case of berya. Every bird starts. It's no different than any bird in the world. Of tameh is, you can say the same thing. The of tameh the same. You have the same argument. So apparently, we're not concerned with that. Meaning, we're looking at the beginning of the life of this bird. In the life of this bird, it's aser.
It was an egg of an off tameh. It was always aser.
Oh, the egg, right? He's saying the egg itself was right. But I understood it because he's saying that the substance, right? He's saying yes, so maybe right. Maybe the substance itself, whatever that substance, the substance it was always, when you started to see it as being a substance of an egg, it was aser. That could be true. Anyway, so that's what he struggles with. But others point out no. But since the point is that we're talking about an efroach, we look at the beginning of when it became an efroach, and when it became this thing called an efroach, it was nicker as being an efroach. So that's when it becomes aser. The other thing the Shach discusses over here, this is a little bit more shchiach, but not so much in our days anymore. That's the case of dam. Beitza sheish ba dam. So is that considered a berya or not? So he points out that the Mechaber himself is unsure about this. The Beis Yosef later on, a little bit back and forth, and he says that here the Mechaber leaves out the case of dam because the Mechaber paskin that dam is not considered a berya. Now, in light of what we just said a moment ago from the crazy, it's a bit of an interesting discussion about the dam because the dam, mitzad ma, is the dam considered a berya. Presumably, the Shach, and I guess the Beis Yosef himself that was mesupik on the case, was understanding that the case of beitza sheish bo efroach, that we are considering it to be a berya is mitzad the egg itself, not mitzad the efroach like the crazy says. That if you say that the egg itself is a berya, so now you can handle maybe by the case of the beitza sheish badam, is that considered a berya? Now lemaisa the shach pask is lahakil, a beitza sheish badam is not considered a berya, as we said bisman hazeh. Anyways, it's not relevant because our eggs are different than the eggs that they had. The last point about eggs, very important, is that eggs is sort of a moot point because we're going to learn much later on in Siman Kuf, now I forgot which, but the halach is a davar shebeminyan. So we have the sug is a davar shebeminyan, which tells us things that are generally counted. The Gemara Beitza says things that are generally or sold in count are considered davar shebeminyan. Eggs ad hayom are still like that. You go, I think, right? I mean, I don't go to the grocery shopping as much, but I should have asked my wife this morning. But I think they still sell a dozen eggs. It's still like that today. So I see my wife come home with cartons, so I'm assuming that's the way it's sold. So things that are sold in numbers are considered davar sheminyan, like eggs, and therefore there ain't a batal mitzvah being a davar sheminyan. So an egg, even if it's not considered a berya, will be considered davar sheminyan. So therefore, if you have an egg, a beitza sheish badam, let's just say, forget about our status bismanazeh of our dam, but bismanehem, when dam was real dam and is a real concern, for sure, we're not questioning about whether the dam was us or bismanehem. The discussion the Shach is having on this siman is whether a beitza sheish badam is considered a davar sheminyan, a berya, but it's a moot point because anyway the beitza is davar sheminyan. So if you have a beitza sheish badam, it's anyway not batal at all. It's afilu be'elef because it's a davar sheminyan. Okay, ad kan this sif. There's a lot more to speak about on the sugis of Berya. I mean, we're going to learn more on Berya now, but from sif aleph, tremendous amount. Let's go weiter. Davar shu Berya, sif base. Davar shu Berya, shenis batel ima heter, im eno makiro, hakol aser. Okay, as we would expect. So if you have a Berya that was cooked with a heter, if you can't detect that Berya, well, everything is aser because afilu be'elef lo batal. And obviously referring to it, the berya was not crushed up. V'haroitev b'nosein tam. The sauce that is in there is b'nosein tam. So therefore, you could, if you could theoretically separate them, so then you'd be able to salvage the sauce as long as it's less than shishim. V'imakiro, okay, so if you recognize your davar shel iser, your berya, zurko, you throw it out. V'acherim, v'harotev, sarach shei bahem, shishim kenegdo. So you take out your berya, and now the remaining parts in the pot are mutter, and that would include the rotev and the other pieces that were in the pot, the pieces of meat, let's just say, or whatever it is, eggs, makes a difference what we're talking about. Sarach shei shishim kenegdo, and you throw it out. Assuming you have shishim keneged, the gufa iser, everything is mutter. Okay, very straightforward, and that's a continuation of what we said a moment ago, that the chumrah of Berya is only mitzad the halacha of yavish b'yavesh, it's not mitzad the halacha of lach b'lach. Mechaber continues, chutz migid hanosha, she'ein tamo oser, de'ein begidim b'nosein tam. The Mechaber says that's not true by gid hanosha. So if I have a gid hanosha, and it falls into your cholent pot in Erev Shabbos, everybody's freaking out, and the gid hanosha is eino batal. Now, if you are unable to detect what is your gid hanosha in your pot, for whatever reason, you can't figure it out, so for sure your whole cholent is also because somewhere in your cholent is a gid hanosha. But that's a theoretical case, because hypothetical, because it's almost impossible not to know that it's there, but hypothetical. But if you remove the gid hanosha, the Mechaber says everything is fine, because the gidim ain't begidim b'nosein tam. So what could possibly go wrong over here? Shein tamo de ain't begidim b'nosein tam. Aval shmeino oser l'tzorch shishim kenegdo lahati arotev. Let's not forget about the shmeino de gid hanosha, the shamein that's around the gid hanosha, that does give tam, and that is aser as well. And for that, you will need to have shishim keneged. So keneged, the gid itself, the gid is eino b'nosein tam, you don't need shishim kenegdo. But keneged the shmeino, I don't even know how large the shmeino is, in reference to the rest of the gid. But al kapanim, that for sure you'll need to be mevato, mitzad tam. Okay, lefikach. Yerech shinis bashel im gido. This is actually how we get into taruvis in Chulin. Mesechas Chulin, the Hilchos Taruvis begins with the halacha of gid hanosha. So this is a very important halacha we're about to learn. He's the starting point of so much of Yoreh is the gid hanosha, the yerech shenis bashel. Lefikach yerech shenis bashel im gidoy. So if you have a thigh, an entire thigh, and most of the thigh is actually mutter, but the yerech was nizbashel im gidoy, im akiro, zorko. If you could recognize that thigh, you take it out, you throw it out. V'chol ashar mutter, and everything else mutter. V'im yesh bo shishim keneged shmeino, kol ashar mutter. V'im yesh shishim keneged shmeino, v'im eino makiro. But if you can't detect your gid hanosha and your whole thigh, kol achatichos asuras, everything is now aser. V'im yesh b'kedera shishim keneged. So you couldn't makiro. You couldn't makiro because you had, let's say you have I guess it really was shkiach, right? You have a case of a yerech shenis bashel gid hanosha, together with other yerechs in there, You have many yerechs floating around in there. One of the yerechs had a gidon noshe, and apparently, I don't know the mitzias well enough, but apparently you can't figure out which one had the gidon noshe in it. Fine. So everything becomes aser. It's a berya. V'im yesh b'kedei shishim keneged shuman mutter haroitev v'im lav aser. And mitzad the roitev, it all depends on noisin tam. V'im nimoya chagid ve'eno niker. So gam kein shishim kenegdoi. If you crush up, if the gid was crushed up and said, not crushed up, it just melted it. So then you need shishim keneged the entire gid. No longer Berya. So no longer Berya, but you need to mevatel b'shishim still. So Berya is a chiddush of filu be'elef lo batel. So here we're not saying a filu be'elef, but here it is batel. But you need to have batel b'shishim. Okay, now there's a bunch of what? Okay. So let's start with that point. Okay, this is a very fun point. The mechaber. So most of this halacha is very straightforward, very is lengthy, but it was something that we could understand. The last line of this mechaber. Let's begin with that. The mechaber says that if I have a gidon noshe and it falls into my cholent pot, so then if the gidon noshe is sholem and I just can't figure it out where it is, again, I don't know the mitzias why that is, but that's what the mechaber says is possible. In any event, it gets mixed up. So then we say afil be'elef lo batel. But if it's nimoch here, all your meat just like turned into a sauce. So then you are able to battle it as long as if shishim can get the gidon noshe. Now the kasha is, and that's what we just asked, is that the gidon noshe is eno benosing tam. And things that are eno benosing tam should not require shishim. So the Shach sort of addresses this, and he says, "Avapisha ein bo tam haTorah sartoi." Even though there's no tam, the Torah answers it. The Taz is myrich a little bit more over here, and he brings from the Rashba, and he says that nusach that the Shach brings down is from the Rashba. He says, yeah, there's no tam. Now the Taz does admit the fact that wait a minute, but it really shouldn't matter so much because it doesn't have tam. He brings it down from the Rashba himself, who was sort of mesupik about the issue. And the Taz writes halacha l'maisa in a case of that some of it was spilled out and you can't determine whether it was shishim, then you can makel based on the svara that there's no tam in the gidon noshe. But still the question is, why do we need to come on to that? Why aren't we makel here? So there's a very lengthy piece from the Minchas Kohen. The Minchas Kohen is one of the most fundamental svarim in Yoreh. The Pri Megadim quotes him all the time. And he went through all of Yoreh systematically explaining every single halacha, analyzing all the points, every point by point the Pri Megadim picks up on, and the poskim later after him also use him as the basis of so much of the analysis of Yoreh. And he asks this kasha, and he says, why is it mutter? And he even bolsters the kasha. We learned in Simin Tzadi Ches that at least the mechaber is mekel with a kfela. A kfela means that you can taste it, and the kfela says there's no taste in here. So as long as we mentioned this a few times, the whole halacha of shishim is a halacha of mistama, there's taste. If you could determine there's no taste, it's mutter. So the Minchas Kohen says, and that's the whole reason for a kfela. This is the best kfela in the world. I can give it, I don't even need a kfela. I know it doesn't have taste in it. So ask the Minchas Kohen, your kasha, hooray, it doesn't have taste. So he doesn't have a clear answer to this. He has such a not clear answer. He's really not happy with this chumrah. He's not happy with the chumrah. He says it doesn't, and he quotes this Rashba, and he says that the Rashba is machmir on a kfela. So he says, I understand why the Rashba is machmir, but he says, but the mechaber is mekel connected the Rashba earlier to yes rely on a kfela. So the mechaber is not going lishitaso, so he's not so satisfied with this halacha. Various answers that are given. The Pri Megadim, the Chavaz Das and the Sivis tries to work this through. It says maybe there's a difference that we only rely on a kfela when it's on the tam, on the guf hadavar. Maybe we don't rely on a kfela. Could be, but that's not true. We actually are mekel. I mean, the mechaber is even on the guf hadavar. So the Yad Yehuda says a very interesting svara. The Yad Yehuda says that we have to differentiate between like when you have a lot of isser there as opposed to muat. He says, when is kfela really going to help you? Kfela is going to help you when you have, let's say, like 50. You have 50 against 1. So then the tam is so kolish and you're not sure if it's left, then the kfela can kick in. But when you have so much isser, the ratio is so high, so then he says, then the kfela will not work. And he says in our sugya, since there's no way to determine all that, we have to always be machmir no matter what. That's what he wants to say. But end of the day, the kasha is stronger than the terutzim. It's a very, very strong kasha. Okay, the other point here that's brought down the Shach discusses is the inyan of davuk, but let's skip out on that point for now. There's a nice piece of the Shach on Isser davuk. Sif Gimel. Oh, no, maybe we'll stop over here. Okay.